Hello again. This set of 5 videos will describe ways of making back splices. We will also learn to splice one of the most popular knob knots, the Matthew Walker knot. This video will introduce the subject, and like my previous videos on splices, each of the following videos will explain in detail how to accomplish each of the splices. If you choose to follow through with any of these other videos, I suggest that you subscribe to my channel. It'll make it a lot easier to skip to the video that you are interested in. The purpose of a back splice is to protect the end of the 3-strand rope. Of course, there are several ways of accomplishing this. If your material is synthetic like this nylon rope, you can just melt it and it works fine. Another way is to serve the end so that it can't unwind and unravel. But the back splice is a more permanent solution. A back splice consists of 2 parts. There's a reversing knot that turns the strands around so that they're ready to splice into the standing part. And then there's the actual splice that can either be over and under or helical, and optionally can be tapered. Here's an example of the helical splice, and this is the over and under splice. These 2 types of splices are explained in my introductory video on splices. If you're new to splicing in 3-strand rope, I suggest that you watch that video first. There are 2 knots that are the foundation for many of the back splices and knob knots: the crown knot and the walnut. We'll eventually be making these knots in the 3-strand rope, but because the strands are so gnarly and twisted, for instruction purposes, I've made up a box and I've taken some cording and seized it to simulate our 3-strand rope, and we'll tie the crown knot and the walnut using this setup. Here I've tied the crown knot. Notice it's got this 3-fold symmetry like a trifoil knot. Think of an airplane propeller. And notice that the cords, or when we tie the knot, this will be the working strands. Notice that they come out facing in a down direction. Here I've tied a walnut, and notice it also has 3-fold symmetry like our propellers. But the difference is that here the working strands are coming in an up direction. One of the problems encountered when tying either of these knots is that neither knot takes its final shape until the tying process and the tightening process are nearly complete. It kind of reminds me of how overlapping of a box's flaps does not result in a secure closure until the final flap is tucked. Similarly, these 2 knots will completely fall apart at any stage prior to the final tuck being made. Let me show you. This is the crown knot in its semi-tightened condition. I'll just take away 1 tuck and you see that there is no knot. That said, the knot really is quite simple and easy to do with practice. Our objective is to be tying the crown and walnut in 3-strand rope, and that brings up another factor. Most ropes you buy today are laid what they call right-hand lay, meaning the thread-like pattern rotates in a right-handed direction. When looked at from the top, that means that the lay of the rope is in a counterclockwise spiral. Both the crown knot and the walnut can be tied with the lay or against the lay. Here I've tied a crown knot with the lay. You can see that the strands rotate in a counterclockwise fashion. Here's the same crown knot tied against the lay, and you can see that the strands now rotate in a clockwise direction. Tying a crown knot has 2 parts to it. One is making the tucks and the other is tightening. Making the tucks can be done in one of 2 ways. I call it the practical way and the textbook way. The tightening is pretty much the same in either method. The first step is to take and orient the rope so that one of the strands is away from you and the other 2 are on your left and right. And in this case, we'll tie the crown knot in the counterclockwise or with delay. You take the far strand and lay it between the two remaining strands. Then you take the strand working in a counterclockwise fashion. You take the left strand and lay it over the bite, and then finally take the right strand and stick it through the original loop. Tighten it slightly, and that's what you get. To tie the knot in what I'd call the textbook fashion, you start the same way. You take the far strand and lay it across, pinch it with your thumb, but you take the right strand and tuck it through the loop. And then finally you take the left strand and tuck it through the loop. And you end up with the same knot. I find the textbook method is a little cumbersome for two reasons. One is when you tie the knot in the textbook, your second step is to tuck a strand through the loop. And then the third step is to tuck the final strand through the loop. That means you have an extra tuck, and when you're dealing with three-strand rope, the strands are all kinkety and hard to maneuver through. Sometimes they're a foot or so long, and it's just cumbersome to have to make that tuck twice instead of just once. The other aspect is, for example, if I'm making a crown knot in a with delay pattern, the practical method is you grab the strands and rotate them in a counterclockwise fashion as you're tying the knot, and it kind of helps you keep track of what's going on. When you use the textbook method, the strands themselves are going counterclockwise, but your tying process going clockwise, and that can lead to some confusion when you're dealing with having to tie the knot either counterclockwise or clockwise. Once you've tied the crown knot by either method, the next step is to tighten the knot. And it's important to work all three strands evenly, because otherwise the knot, I'll give you an example, it can kind of capsize and you kind of lose track of what your objective was. If you keep all the strands coming in slowly, eventually it'll get tight enough where the friction between the strand and the adjacent loop starts to hold the knot, and then in the final stage it actually sort of locks. You know you've got all three strands of equal tightness when the three lobes are the same height. It looks like, for example, right now this one's a little loose, so I can tighten it up and get the symmetry correct, and then the knot's complete. I'll tie the crown knot one more time, and then I suggest you pause the video and practice a little bit before continuing with the instructions. Next, we'll tie the crown knot against delay. That will be in a clockwise fashion. We start again by taking the far strand and making a bite. In this case, we're going in a clockwise direction, so we take the right hand strand and lay it in the bite, and finally take the left hand strand and tuck it through the original bite. We'll do that once more. This is a crown knot laid against the lay, or in a clockwise direction. The last of the foundation knots that we'll look at is the walnut. It's tied similar to the crown knot, except we're actually tying it upside down, which is somewhat confusing. We'll take the strand that's away from us, and instead of tucking over like we do with the crown knot, we tuck under. This knot can also be tied with or against the lay, but for our purposes we'll tie it with the lay, so that means we'll take our left strand and tuck it under both of these strands, and then the final tuck is coming up through the original bite. Let me demonstrate that again. This knot is actually easier to tighten than the crown knot. You can take the three strands and get the tips located at the same position, and then just push down on the knot and it'll sort of self-tighten. As it's tightening, it wants to collapse over the standing part of the rope, which is what you want it to do. So you can kind of help it along by pushing down on those bites. And if we flip it upside down, you can kind of see the crown knot, except that the standing part is going through the center. And when you're finished, you want the three strands coming out of the knot to be at the top. Now that we can tie the three foundation knots, we can move on to tying our back splices. The next video, we'll look at making a simple back splice with a crown knot as a turning knot and an over and under tuck. There won't be any taper. The third video will look at a back splice that uses a crown knot and a helical spiral splice. The fourth, and this is the most complicated of the back splices, is a back splice where the different strands are tapered, and it gives the effect of the rope staying the same diameter throughout the back splice. In our final fifth video, we'll look at putting a Matthew Walker knot in the rope. Often we'll put this just ahead of the back splice, so it ends up being a good hand grip at the end of a rope, if that's what you need.